A desperate millionaire awaits an investor who promised to save his struggling company. The visitor arrives with expensive wine to celebrate the partnership. Just as they're about to toast, the cleaner's daughter bursts into the room, pretending to trip Hughes, and spills wine all over his suit. "Sir, I'm sorry for the accident." He grows furious, until she whispers something in his ear that makes his blood run cold. The scent of single-origin pour-over coffee, strong and sophisticated, hung in the air of Arthur Vance's office, but it couldn't mask the denser fragrance of desperation. From the height of his glass and steel empire, with New York City sprawling at his feet like a tapestry of lights and opportunity, he felt like the most vulnerable man in the world. Every tick of the antique oak clock on his wall was a hammer blow to the coffin of his company. The creation of a lifetime now drowning in silent debts and broken promises. The confidence that had always been his armor now felt like foolish naivety, an open invitation to the predators circling the scent of his financial weakness. Today, however, hope had a name: Richard Vargas, an international investor whose reputation preceded him, a man who, with a single signature, could irrigate his financial desert and make everything bloom again. Arthur adjusted his silk tie for the third time, his hand trembling slightly. He needed everything to be perfect. Salvation was on its way, and he couldn't afford to fail. On the other side of the glass panel separating the conference room from the main corridor, little 8-year-old Clara watched the scene with a curiosity only childhood allows. Sitting on the floor next to her mother Lena's cleaning cart, she was drawing in a worn, yellow-page notebook, but her dark, attentive eyes didn't miss a single movement of the elegant, distressed man. She saw him every day, that giant with broad shoulders who sometimes smiled at her, but today he seemed smaller, stooped under an invisible weight. Her mother always said that Mr. Vance was a good man, just a little blind to the world's wickedness. Clara didn't quite understand what that meant, but she felt the tension in the air, an electricity that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The arrival of Richard Vargas was like an actor taking the stage, punctual, charismatic, and with a smile that seemed sculpted to disarm. He brought with him not a briefcase full of documents, but a bottle of red wine, a vintage Bordeaux, so expensive the bottle itself seemed to whisper of luxury. "Arthur, my friend," his voice boomed, filling the tense silence. "To celebrate our partnership in advance. The future is bright." Arthur, flooded by a wave of relief, accepted the offer with an almost childlike enthusiasm. That gesture, so confident and generous, was the sign he had been waiting for. Salvation was real. As the two men sat at the polished table, crystal glasses reflecting the city lights, Clara watched, fascinated. Her mother had told her to be quiet, but the glass was like a movie screen. She saw Richard Vargas pour the wine, his body strategically blocking Arthur's view for an instant. It was a swift, almost imperceptible movement. With his left hand, he gestured, telling an animated story about a deal in Zurich. With his right, he discreetly pulled a small packet from his suit jacket pocket. With a fake smile plastered on his face, he turned slightly, and Clara saw with a clarity that froze her blood. He emptied a fine in white powder into the glass meant for her mother's boss. The gesture was so subtle, so rehearsed, that an inattentive adult would never have noticed. But the eyes of a child, free from assumption, saw the raw, naked truth. Richard's smile widened, now genuine in its cruelty. He raised the tainted glass, offering it to Arthur. "To a new beginning, my friend. May this be the first of many successes." Arthur, blinded by hope, took the glass, his eyes shining with gratitude. He brought it to his lips, the dark liquid inches from sealing his fate. In that instant, time seemed to stop for Clara. A scream was trapped in her throat. She had to do something. Without thinking, she shot to her feet and ran. She pushed the heavy glass door with all her might and, feigning a clumsy stumble, threw herself against the table, deliberately knocking the glass from Richard's hand. The red wine exploded over the investor's expensive suit, a dark stain spreading like a wound. Amid the chaos, she clung to Arthur's leg and whispered, her voice trembling with panic, "Sir, I'm sorry for the accident. I saw him put something in your glass." For one eternal moment, Arthur's world was reduced to the sound of his own breathing and the frightened sobs of Clara, who still clung to his leg like a castaway to a piece of driftwood. Richard Vargas's face twisted into a mask of theatrical fury. Unbelievable. This clumsy girl has ruined a $5,000 suit. What is this, Arthur? Bring your kids to business meetings now. His voice was a razor, cutting the air and aiming for humiliation. Lena, Clara's mother, burst into the room, her face pale with terror. "Mr. Vance, I'm so sorry. Clara, come here right now. What have you done?" She tried to pull her daughter away, but the girl didn't move, her eyes fixed on Arthur, pleading for him to believe. Arthur's heart was a battlefield. On one side, the logic of a desperate businessman screamed that it was an accident, a childish fantasy that was costing him the deal of a lifetime. On the other, the terrified whisper and the firmness in the child's gaze planted a terrible seed of doubt. "It was an accident, Richard. She's just a child," Arthur said, his voice more controlled than he felt. He helped Clara to her feet, keeping a protective hand on her shoulder. His eyes, however, were not on Richard. They were on the fallen glass, on the plush carpet, where a pool of red wine was spreading. And that's when he saw it, at the bottom of the crystal, where a last remnant of the liquid remained. Tiny white granules clung to the glass, glinting under the office lights. They hadn't fully dissolved. They were foreign, alien, undeniably there. Arthur's blood ran cold. Clara's voice echoed in his mind, no longer as a child's whisper, but as a deafening alarm. "Because I saw him put something in your glass." The truth hit him with the force of a punch to the gut, stealing his breath and replacing it with an icy terror. He almost drank it. He was a second away from what? The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. Richard's anger now seemed forced, his indignation a performance. Arthur, in turn, felt a cold clarity wash over him. His financial desperation evaporated, replaced by a primal instinct for survival. He looked at Richard, but this time he truly saw him, not a savior, but a smiling predator. "Lena," Arthur said, his voice as firm as steel, "take Clara to the kitchenette and wait for me, please." Lena, confused by the sudden change but obedient to the authority in his tone, took her daughter's hand and led her out, casting one last terrified glance at the two men. Alone, the tension became almost unbearable. "I think this meeting is over," Arthur said, walking slowly to his desk and positioning himself between Richard and the door. "This incident has soured the mood. Let's reschedule." Richard studied him for a moment, his fake smile vanishing to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. He realized the game had changed. "Of course, Arthur. As you wish, send me the dry cleaning bill." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door and glanced over his shoulder, his gaze passing over Arthur and fixing on the hallway where Clara had disappeared. Kids, they see things, don't they? Vivid imaginations. You have to be careful what they make up. It wasn't a casual remark. It was a veiled threat, a seed of fear planted with surgical precision. As soon as the door closed, Arthur rushed to it and locked it. The sound of the deadbolt clicking into place echoed in the deathly silence of the office. He leaned against the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the stain on the carpet, at the fallen glass. Carefully, as if handling a dangerous artifact, he picked up the glass and held it to the light. There they were, the remnants of the powder. The proof that his life, his future, everything he had worked for, had rested in the hands of an 8-year-old girl. The gratitude he felt was overwhelming, but it was quickly swallowed by a new and terrible realization. The predator knew he had been seen, and the witness was the fragile, brave child he now had a duty to protect. Night fell over the city, but in Arthur's office, the darkness was deeper. The glittering lights outside seemed to mock the panic that had settled in his chest. He had dismissed all his employees, inventing an excuse about a maintenance emergency. Only Lena and Clara remained, sheltered in his personal office, an improvised sanctuary amidst the chaos of his thoughts. Every shadow in the hallway seemed a threat, every ding of the elevator an imminent danger. Richard Vargas's veiled threat echoed in his mind. You have to be careful what they make up. He wasn't talking about Clara's imagination, but about the danger she posed to him. The girl was a witness, and the coldness in Vargas's eyes made it clear what happened to inconvenient witnesses. Arthur felt the crushing weight of responsibility. The life of this child, who had saved him on pure instinct, was now irrevocably tied to his, and he had no idea how to protect her. While Arthur paced, his mind racing, Clara sat on a soft leather sofa, drawing. She seemed oblivious to the danger surrounding her, but there was a tension in her small shoulders that belied her apparent calm. Lena, on the other hand, was a bundle of nerves. She twisted a tissue in her hands, her eyes flitting from her daughter to Arthur, then to the locked door. Mr. Vance, what's happening? That man, he seemed so angry. Am I going to lose my job? Clara didn't mean to cause trouble. Her voice was a thread of anguish. Arthur stopped and looked at her, his heart aching with guilt. His own dangerous naivety had dragged these two innocent people into the center of a nightmare. Lena, you're not going to lose your job, he said, his voice heavy with a gravity that frightened her. In fact, you and Clara are the most important people in this building right now, and I need you to trust me. He knelt in front of Clara, trying to find the right words. Clara, honey, you were very, very brave today. You did the right thing. The girl looked up from her drawing, her eyes large and serious. I saw him, sir. He was a bad man. His smile didn't reach his eyes. The simplicity of that childlike observation was more astute than any business analysis Arthur had ever conducted. He had been fooled by spreadsheets and projections, while a child had read the truth in a man's face. Yes, he was, Arthur agreed, and because you saw him, we need to be very careful. He then turned to Lena. That man is not who he says he is. And what Clara saw, what she stopped him from doing, was very serious. I can't explain everything right now, but you both could be in danger. From now on, you'll come to and from work with me, and you'll stay here in the office until I say it's safe. Lena paled, fear finally overriding her concern for her job. In danger? But why? We're just us. The vulnerability in her voice was palpable. They lived in a modest Queens apartment, a world light years away from this penthouse office and its million-dollar deals. How could they be targets for such a powerful man? Arthur knew he couldn't reveal the whole truth yet. The idea that her daughter had prevented an assassination attempt would be too much for her to bear. For now, protection was the priority. He discreetly contacted an old college friend, now a renowned chemist, and arranged a clandestine meeting. He would give him the glass and a sample of the wine spilled on Richard's suit, which he had carefully collected. He needed concrete proof, a scientific confirmation that would turn his terrifying suspicion into an undeniable fact. That night, as he drove Lena and Clara home in his armored sedan, a vehicle that once seemed an extravagance of his wealth and had now become a necessity, he couldn't shake the image of Vargas's face. The threat wasn't just about what Clara had seen, but what she represented, a flaw in a meticulous plan. And people like Vargas did not tolerate flaws. As he dropped them at the door of their modest apartment, he saw the neighborhood shadows shift and felt a chill run down his spine. He was no longer fighting to save his company. He was fighting to save 3 lives, including his own. And the first step was to find out exactly what or who he was up against. He just hoped the lab analysis would give him the answers before it was too late. 2 days passed in a state of constant vigilance. Arthur turned his office into a fortress, installing new cameras and hiring, under the guise of corporate consulting, a discreet security team. Lena and Clara arrived and left with him, their daily routines encapsulated within the protective bubble he was trying to create. For Clara, the change was a strange adventure. She spent her afternoons doing homework at a mahogany desk worth more than her family's apartment, while her mother cleaned the empty offices with a nervous efficiency, always keeping an eye on her daughter. For Lena, the situation was a source of mounting fear. She didn't understand the exact nature of the threat, but she felt its weight in Arthur's rigid posture and the watchful eyes of the men in suits who now patrolled the hallways. Arthur, for his part, was running on coffee and adrenaline. He barely slept, his mind endlessly replaying the moment he almost drank from that glass, every detail seared into his memory. The wait for the lab results was torture. The call from his chemist friend, Mark, came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. "Arthur, I need to see you now, not at your office. Meet me at the bookstore cafe on Bleecker Street in an hour, and come alone." Mark's tone was devoid of any pleasantries. It was the tone of a man dealing with grim, undeniable facts. Arthur's stomach churned. He left Clara under the supervision of a trusted security guard and told Lena he had an urgent matter to attend to. At the cafe, rain lashed against the windows, creating a melancholic backdrop. Mark was already there, sitting at a table in the back, a manila envelope in front of him. He wasted no time on greetings. "Arthur, what the hell have you gotten yourself into?" he asked, his voice low and intense. With the powder in the glass and on the suit fabric, this wasn't just some street-level substance. It was a highly sophisticated combination of a fast-acting cardiotoxin and an agent that masks the initial symptoms, making it look like a massive coronary. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. Massive coronary. It would have been quick, apparently natural. No one would have suspected a thing. His death would have been just another statistic, the tragic result of a stressed-out executive on the brink of bankruptcy. "And the scariest part," Mark continued, sliding the envelope across the table, "is the purity of the compound. This isn't something you buy online. This is professional lab work, custom-made. Whoever prepared this knew exactly what they were doing. If you had taken a single sip, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Arthur opened the envelope. Inside was a detailed report with charts and chemical formulas he barely understood, but the conclusion was clear, printed in bold at the bottom of the page. Lethal dosage, estimated time to death under 5 minutes. The terror he had felt since the incident now had a name, a formula, a scientific certainty. Clara's observation wasn't a fantasy. It was the only thing that stood between him and death. His gratitude for the girl mingled with a retrospective dread so intense he had to grip the table to keep from fainting. As he drove back to the office, the rain outside seemed to have seeped into his soul, leaving it cold and drenched. The scientific confirmation changed everything. This was no longer about a bad business deal or a con man trying to take advantage of his vulnerability. This was a cold, calculated elimination attempt. And the only witness was an 8-year-old child. Richard Vargas's threat was no longer a vague possibility. It was a terrifying certainty. He had to do more to protect Clara and Lena. Hiring security wasn't enough. The enemy was more sophisticated, more dangerous than he had imagined. When he entered his office, he found Clara showing one of the security guards a drawing she had made. It was a picture of a knight in shining armor protecting a small flower from a serpent with a cruel smile. The symbolism was so clear it hurt. That night, obsessively searching Richard Vargas's name online, he found something. A small article in a European financial journal from 2 years ago. It mentioned the sudden and unexpected death of a real estate magnate who suffered a massive heart attack during a meeting to finalize an expansion partnership. The name of the international investor with him at the time of death wasn't mentioned, but Arthur felt a cold dread creep up his spine. It was a hunch, a tenuous connection, but his gut screamed it was no coincidence. He began to dig deeper, cross-referencing obituaries of wealthy businessmen with news of major international deals. The pattern began to emerge, ghostly and terrifying. And then he received a text from an unknown number. It was a single photo. The photo was of the playground outside Clara's school in Queens, taken from a distance. The caption was simple: "Imagination can be a dangerous thing." The war had begun. The photo of the playground was a punch to the solar plexus. It was a violation, a clear demonstration that the walls of his office and the security guards he'd hired were not impenetrable. They knew where Clara went to school. They could get close. The threat was no longer a distant shadow. It was knocking on his door, breathing down his neck. Fear gave way to a cold, sharp anger. Arthur spent the night awake, no longer researching the past, but planning the future. The protection of Clara and Lena became his sole obsession. The next morning, he informed them that, for security reasons, Clara would not be going to school for the foreseeable future. He would hire a private tutor to come to the office. Lena protested, worried about her daughter's education and social life, but Arthur's grim expression and the simple statement that they know where she studies were enough to silence any argument. The fear in her eyes was a reflection of his own. The days that followed melted into a claustrophobic routine. The penthouse office, once a symbol of power and success, became a gilded cage. Clara, surprisingly, adapted with a resilience that haunted Arthur. She turned a corner of the conference room into her own little world, with books, colored pencils, and a whiteboard where her new tutor, a kind young teacher named Michael, taught her math and history. She seemed to understand, on an intuitive level that adults had lost, the gravity of the situation. Sometimes Arthur would catch her watching him, her dark eyes filled with a precocious wisdom. It was as if she knew she was the anchor in his storm. The reason for this entire fight, their bond deepened with each passing day, forged in the fire of shared danger. He was no longer just Mr. Vance, her mother's boss. He was her protector, and she, his little savior. While life inside the office followed a tense but controlled rhythm, the outside world grew increasingly hostile. Arthur hired a private investigator, a grizzled ex-NYPD detective named Jonas Keller, a man with eyes that had seen it all. Jonas's task was to investigate Richard Vargas and any connection to the suspicious deaths Arthur had uncovered. Jonas's initial reports were frustrating. Richard Vargas was a ghost. He had multiple passports, corporate identities that dissolved after each deal, and a financial trail that vanished into offshore tax havens. "This man is a professional, Arthur," Jonas said in one of their secret meetings. "He doesn't leave a trail. It's like he reinvents himself for every job." The pressure on Lena was immense. Her relatives and neighbors started asking questions. Why were she and Clara being driven around by bodyguards? Why wasn't Clara in school anymore? Rumors began to circulate in her neighborhood. Malicious stories about her having an affair with her wealthy boss. One evening, arriving home, she found a note slipped under her door. No direct threats. Just a sentence made of letters cut from magazines. "Curious people get hurt." Lena broke down. The constant fear, the social pressure, and the worry for her daughter were shattering her. That night, in the office, she confronted Arthur, tears streaming down her exhausted face. "I can't take this anymore. My life has become a living hell. We have to go to the police." Arthur, whose own instinct was to seek official help, hesitated. Jonas had warned him. And if these people are sophisticated enough to create untraceable poisons and ghost identities, they could have contacts everywhere, including inside the force. Going to them without irrefutable proof could be the same as handing them your location and your witnesses. The decision weighed on him. Going to the police could be their salvation or their death sentence. As he and Lena argued, Clara's small, trembling voice cut through the tension. She was standing in the doorway, holding her mother's phone. I think I have proof," she said hesitantly. "I took a picture." Arthur and Lena turned to her, stunned. "A picture of what, honey?" Arthur asked, his heart starting to race. Clara looked at the floor, abashed. "When the bad man put the powder in your glass, I had Mom's phone and I don't know why, I just pointed it and pushed the button." Clara's revelation landed in the room like a stone in a silent pond, creating shockwaves that hit Arthur and Lena with full force. A photograph, visual proof captured at the exact moment of the act. The idea was so improbable, so miraculous, that Arthur could barely process it. He knelt before the girl, his heart hammering. "Clara, are you sure? Show me." With trembling fingers, Clara scrolled through the photo gallery on her mother's phone. She passed images of birthday parties, trips to the park, smiling selfies with Lena. And then she stopped on one. It was slightly blurry, taken from a low angle, as you would expect from a hidden child. But the content was unmistakable and devastating. The photo captured Richard Vargas's hand, the gold signet ring on his little finger glinting under the light, hovering over Arthur's crystal glass. The small white packet was tilted, and a fine stream of powder could be seen falling into the red wine. Vargas's face wasn't visible, only his smug, almost predatory smile reflected in the curved glass. Arthur felt the air being sucked from his lungs. It was the proof he needed, the silver bullet that could take down the ghost. It was more than the lab report, more than his suspicions. It was the truth, frozen in time, captured by the instinct of a child who knew she was witnessing something terribly wrong. "My God, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and terror. You have no idea what you've done." Lena looked at the photo over his shoulder, and a sob escaped her lips. The abstract danger had become a concrete, terrifying image. The elegant man she'd seen in the hallway was, in fact, trying to kill her boss, and her daughter had recorded it all. The fragility of their situation became unbearably real. The existence of the photo completely changed the game. Now they had a weapon, but a weapon, in the wrong hands or used recklessly, could be dangerous to the one wielding it. The debate about going to the police reignited, but with a new sense of urgency and a new risk calculation. If they handed over the photo, it would become official evidence. But as Jonas had warned, what if the system was compromised? The photo could disappear. Worse, it would officially confirm that Clara was the sole eyewitness who could connect the hand in the photo to the face of Richard Vargas. It would turn her from a potential threat into a primary target. The weight of the decision was crushing Arthur. Protecting the proof meant continuing to live in the shadows, in constant danger. Handing it over could accelerate a resolution, but it could also put Clara at even greater risk. As they deliberated, the campaign of intimidation against Lena intensified. One morning, she found the tire of her car, which Arthur had insisted she keep for emergencies, slashed. The next afternoon, a man bumped into her accidentally at the building exit, whispering as he passed, "Your daughter has a very photographic memory. It'd be a shame if something happened to the camera." The message was clear. They knew about the photo, or at least they strongly suspected. The net was closing in. Lena's fear turned into a palpable panic. She could no longer sleep, jumping at every sound. The pressure was consuming her. The tension culminated on a Friday night. Arthur, Lena, and Clara were preparing to leave the office, following the security ritual that had become routine. Arthur's phone rang. It was Jonas, the investigator. His voice was tense, urgent. "Arthur, I have bad news." The assistant DA who was quietly looking into the other businessmen's deaths for me, he was in a car accident this afternoon. His car was found at the bottom of the East River. The NYPD is calling it an accident, but I don't buy it. He was the only official I trusted. We're on our own. The news was a devastating blow. The last thread of hope for an official solution had been severed. They were isolated, hunted by an organization that could eliminate a district attorney and make it look like an accident. As Arthur absorbed the news, Lena let out a scream. She was staring out the panoramic window, down at the parking lot below. Arthur rushed to her side. Under the dim light of a lamppost, he saw it. Two men were standing beside Lena's car, looking directly up at his office window. They weren't trying to hide. They were sending a message. And then, one of them raised a phone and took a picture of them, watching them back. The camera flash from below was like a lightning strike, illuminating the terrible reality of their situation. They weren't just being watched, they were being cornered. That brazen, almost mocking act of taking their picture was a declaration of power. It said, "We know where you are. We see you. There's nowhere to run." Panic bubbled in Arthur's chest, cold and sharp. Lena trembled beside him, her face a mask of pure terror. Only Clara, standing between the two adults, seemed strangely calm. Her eyes were fixed on the men below, not with fear, but with a focused intensity, as if memorizing every detail. That moment was the breaking point. The strategy of hiding in the glass fortress had failed. The gilded cage had become a bullseye. Arthur knew, with a desperate clarity, that he had to change tactics. Passively reacting was no longer an option. "They won't touch us here," Arthur said, more to convince himself than the others. "Security is on high alert, but we can't stay, not tonight." He picked up the phone and called Jonas, his voice low and urgent. "They're here, outside the building, two men. They took a picture of us in the window." There was a pause on the line, followed by a heavy sigh from Jonas. "Get out of there now, Arthur. But not through the front. Use the rear service exit. I have a car waiting for you 3 blocks away, on Orchard Street. It's an unmarked grey sedan. The driver's a good man. He'll take you to a safe house." A safe house. The phrase seemed like a distant fantasy. Was any place in the world safe for them? The plan was set in motion with frantic speed. Arthur grabbed a go bag he had already prepared with cash, documents, and an encrypted laptop. Lena took Clara by the hand. The on-duty security guard, a burly man named David, guided them through the silent, deserted corridors to the service elevator. The descent felt like an eternity. Every creak of the elevator was a potential gunshot. When they reached the underground garage, the air was cold and smelled of damp concrete. David led them through a maze of pillars and sleeping luxury cars to a discreet metal door. "This leads to an alley. Jonas's car will be to your left, at the end of the street. Go fast and don't look back." They stepped out into the dark, damp alley. The city, which looked so majestic and orderly from above, was a chaos of shadows and unfamiliar sounds at street level. The smell of garbage and rain filled the air. Arthur held Lena's hand, who in turn held Clara's with a desperate grip. They ran, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the brick walls. Orchard Street seemed miles away. When they finally reached the corner, they saw the grey sedan, just as Jonas had described. Engine running, lights off. It looked like a refuge, a lifeboat in a stormy sea. They were just feet away, safety almost within their grasp, when a black sedan with tinted windows screeched around the corner at high speed, tires singing on the wet asphalt. It didn't slow down. Instead, it accelerated, coming straight for them. Time slowed to a crawl. Arthur saw the blinding headlights, heard the engines roar, felt Lena's hand crush his. His first instinct was to shove Lena and Clara out of the way, to sacrifice himself. But in that millisecond, something unexpected happened. Clara, who was practically being dragged, yanked her hand free from her mother's. With surprising agility, she threw herself to the side, not toward the safety of the sidewalk, but toward a pile of cardboard boxes stacked near a dumpster. "In here!" she yelled, her high-pitched voice cutting through the engine noise. With no time to think, Arthur and Lena followed her lead and dove behind her, plunging into the pile of cardboard an instant before the black car zipped past the exact spot where they'd been standing. So close, they felt the rush of displaced air. The car didn't stop. It sped on and vanished into the darkness. They were alive, shaking, dirty, but alive. And their salvation hadn't come from a trained bodyguard or a wealthy businessman, but from the survival instinct of an 8-year-old girl forged on the unpredictable streets of her neighborhood. The silence that followed the engine's roar was almost as terrifying as the noise itself. For a moment, the three of them remained motionless, nestled among the damp cardboard boxes, the smell of wet paper and metallic fear mingling in the air. Arthur was the first to move. He pushed himself up, his heart still hammering against his ribs, and helped Lena to her feet. She was in shock, her eyes wide and fixed on the point where the car had disappeared. Clara, however, was already standing, dusting off her pants, her face pale, but her eyes shining with a lucid adrenaline. "I've seen cars do that in my neighborhood," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "When they want to scare someone, they drive close, but not too close. They were just trying to scare us." The cold, childish analysis of the situation was both brilliant and heartbreaking. What kind of childhood teaches a girl to differentiate the nuances of violent intimidation? The driver of the grey sedan, a man with an impassive face who introduced himself only as Harris, ran toward them. "Are you okay? I saw the whole thing. Get in the car, quick!" He rushed them into the vehicle. And within seconds, they were pulling away, leaving behind the alley that had nearly become their tomb. The car's interior was a cocoon of silence and temporary safety. Lena finally broke down, her sobs coming in silent, convulsive waves. Arthur held her, murmuring words of comfort that felt hollow and inadequate. His own nerves were shredded. The arrogance that had always defined him, the belief that he could control any situation with money and power, had been utterly destroyed. In that alley, facing imminent death, he wasn't a millionaire. He was just a man, as fragile and frightened as any other. And his survival, once again, had depended on the instinctive wisdom of a child. Humiliation and gratitude waged a war inside him. They drove for nearly an hour, leaving the city center behind and entering increasingly anonymous suburbs. Finally, they pulled up to a modest, ordinary-looking house on a quiet cul-de-sac. "Jonas set this place up for you," Harris said. "No one will look for you here. There's food, clothes, everything you need. The house is registered to a shell corporation. You're safe for now. For now." The two words hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. The house was clean and impersonal. It felt more like a hideout than a home. That first night, no one slept. Arthur sat in the dark living room, laptop on his knees, trying to find a flaw in Richard Vargas's armor, a crack in the organization he could exploit. Lena stayed in the bedroom with Clara, holding her sleeping daughter and praying silently. In the days that followed, the house became their universe. The initial tension gave way to a new family dynamic, forged by adversity. Arthur, stripped of his expensive suits and CEO persona, learned to cook simple meals with the supplies Harris brought them. Lena, and far from her routine as a cleaner, revealed a strength and resilience Arthur had never noticed. But it was Clara who fascinated him most. She didn't see the situation as a confinement, but as an opportunity. She explored every corner of the house, discovered secret passages in the overgrown backyard, and most importantly, watched Arthur work. She would sit beside him for hours, staring at the laptop screen as he sifted through financial records and news articles in multiple languages. "What are you looking for?" she asked one day. Arthur, surprised, tried to explain it simply. "I'm looking for a mistake. A little detail the bad man might have left behind." Clara frowned, deep in thought. "Sometimes," she said, "the mistakes aren't in the papers. They're in the stories people tell." That observation, so simple and profound, ignited a new idea in Arthur's mind. He had been looking for data, for numbers. Maybe he should be looking for people, for survivors. Clara's phrase, "The mistakes are in the stories people tell," lodged itself in Arthur's mind like an anchor. He had spent days immersed in an ocean of impersonal data, searching for patterns in financial transactions and corporate filings. Now, he realized he'd been looking at the map, but ignoring the human territory. Vargas's organization wasn't made of algorithms, it was made of people. People who might have families, weaknesses, regrets, and, most importantly, there might be other victims who had, by some miracle, escaped. The idea that he wasn't alone in this fight sparked a glimmer of hope in the darkness of his isolation. With Jonas acting as his eyes and ears in the outside world, Arthur shifted the focus of his investigation. He started looking not just for the dead, but for the near-dead. Jonas, using his contacts on the Force and in the informational underworld, began to unearth stories. They were whispers, rumors of businessmen who had suffered bizarre accidents or sudden, unexplained illnesses shortly after meetings with potential foreign investors. Most of these stories had been dismissed as coincidence or paranoia, but to Arthur, they formed a sinister constellation with Richard Vargas, or one of his many aliases, at the center. One story in particular caught his attention: a tech mogul in Berlin who, 3 years earlier, had survived an elevator free fall in his own building. The incident was ruled a mechanical failure, but the businessman, a man named Klaus Richter, had always insisted it was sabotage. He had been on his way to a final meeting with an investor who fit Vargas's description perfectly. While Arthur delved into this new line of inquiry, life in the safe house continued its peculiar rhythm. The relationship between him, Lena, and Clara solidified, transcending the barriers of class and circumstance that had once defined them. One afternoon, as Arthur hit a wall of digital dead ends, Clara approached him with a notebook and pencil. "Draw him for me," she said, with the simplicity of a command. "Draw the bad man's face." Arthur hesitated. To revisit that face was to revisit the terror. But something in the determination of Clara's eyes compelled him to obey. He was no artist, but with her help, recalling chilling details like the way his eye twitched a little when he smiled, he managed to sketch a portrait. The result was crude, but it captured the cold, calculating essence of Richard Vargas. Meanwhile, Lena, who had spent the first few days in a state of paralyzing fear, began to find her own way to fight back. She didn't understand finance or investigations, but she understood people. Using a burner phone provided by Jonas, she began to carefully contact other cleaners and low-level service staff who had worked in the buildings where the other victims had died or suffered accidents. She spoke their language, the language of the invisible, those who see and hear everything but are rarely noticed. She asked about strange days, about visitors who didn't seem to fit, about fire alarms that went off for no reason. Slowly, she began to piece together a mosaic of small anomalies that alone meant nothing, but together painted a picture of infiltration and meticulous planning. The most shocking discovery, however, came from one of Lena's conversations. A former colleague who worked in the building of the real estate magnate who had died of a heart attack 2 years prior remembered something odd. In the weeks leading up to her boss's death, a new maintenance technician had started working on the executive floor. A quiet, efficient man who had access to everything, from the HVAC system to the coffee machine. Lena's colleague described him as pleasant, but with one strange detail. He wore a gold signet ring on the little finger of his right hand. The same hand Arthur and Clara saw pour the powder into his glass. The same ring that was in the photo. The organization didn't just attack from the outside, it infiltrated, planting agents inside the companies months before the final strike to study routines, vulnerabilities, the layout of the office. Arthur looked at the walls of the safe house and, for the first time, wondered who had worked on it before they arrived. The revelation that Vargas's organization infiltrated its targets, companies, was a watershed moment. The danger wasn't just an external predator. It was a virus that embedded itself from within, corrupting trust and turning the familiar into the threatening. Arthur felt a retrospective chill, thinking of how many employees in his own company could have been part of the scheme. The receptionist who always knew his schedule, the assistant with access to his financials, the ambitious young man in M&A. Every friendly face in his memory was now haunted by suspicion. He had been hunted like prey for far longer than he'd imagined, observed and analyzed by people he had blindly trusted. His arrogance hadn't just made him vulnerable, it had made him complicit in his own entrapment. This discovery gave new purpose to Lena's work. She was no longer just collecting anomalies, she was hunting ghosts, searching for temporary employees, consultants, or maintenance techs who appeared mysteriously before any accident and vanished shortly after. With Jonas's help, she cross-referenced personnel records from different target companies. The pattern was undeniable. Multiple false names, but always similar descriptions. A quiet man, an IT technician, a security consultant, and, in 2 other cases, the mention of a gold signet ring. They weren't dealing with a lone wolf, but with a patient, disciplined pack. While Lena and Jonas mapped the network of infiltrators, Arthur and Clara focused on a different puzzle. Arthur had managed, through back channels, to obtain digital copies of some documents seized in the investigation of the DA's accident. Most of the files were corrupted or encrypted, but a small set of the DA's personal notes had survived. They were scribbles, codes, and references to old cases that made no sense to Arthur. He spent days trying to decipher them, feeling that the answers were there, hidden in plain sight. It was Clara who saw what he couldn't. Accustomed to the word puzzles and brain teasers her mother bought her from newsstands, she noticed something in the scribbles. "Those aren't letters," she said, pointing to a sequence of symbols. "They're pictures. They look like the trading cards we swap at school." Following Clara's logic, Arthur realized the DA hadn't been using a complex cryptographic code, but a simple, almost childish symbol system. Perhaps so no one would take it seriously if they found it. A symbol that looked like a small tower stood for bank. A wave meant offshore transaction. A setting sun, account closure. Guided by Clara's intuition, Arthur began to translate the scribbles. What emerged was the framework of a money laundering operation, the financial skeleton of Vargas's empire. And at the end of the notes was a list of names, not of victims, but of future targets. Names of business leaders in Chicago, San Francisco, even Dallas. Next to each name was a date, the projected date of the accident. The next name on the list was a well-known philanthropist, the owner of a hospital network in Chicago, and the date was 1 week away. The discovery filled them with an overwhelming sense of urgency. They were no longer just fighting for their own survival. They were in a race against time to save others. But how to warn them? An anonymous phone call would be dismissed as a prank. Going to the police was still an incalculable risk. They had the list, the key to dismantling the entire operation, but they were trapped in their safe house, powerless. The frustration was a poison, eating away at the hope they had just found. That night, the tension in the house was palpable. Arthur paced, Lena prayed in a corner, and Clara sat silently, staring at the portrait she had helped draw. Suddenly, she stood up and walked over to Arthur. "But we can't call the police," she said, with a seriousness that belied her age. "But maybe we can call the TV." Arthur looked at her, confused. "What do you mean, honey?" "The lady on the evening news," Clara continued. "She's always telling stories about bad people and helping the good people. She's not a cop. She tells stories to everyone. If everyone knows, the bad man won't be able to hide." The logic was, once again, brilliantly simple. If they couldn't use the system, maybe they could use public opinion as a weapon, expose the organization on a major national news broadcast. It would be a desperate, high-stakes move. It would reveal their identities, blow their cover, but it might be the only way to stop the clock that was already ticking for the next victim. Clara's idea to take the story to the press was the riskiest play they could imagine. It was like pushing all their chips in on a single bet. Exposing the organization on national television would mean painting a giant target on their own backs, surrendering any hope of anonymity or a return to a normal life. Yet, the alternative, standing by while someone else walked into the same trap that had nearly killed him, was morally impossible for Arthur. The responsibility for the lives on the DA's list weighed on him. After a long, agonizing discussion with Lena and Jonas, the decision was made. They would do it. Their target was Andrea Davenport, a renowned investigative journalist known for her courage and integrity, famous for protecting her sources at all costs. She was the lady on the evening news Clara so admired. Jonas made the initial contact, using an extreme security protocol to ensure they weren't traced. Andrea's response was skeptical, as expected. She received dozens of tips about wild conspiracies every day. But Jonas baited the hook with a single detail: Richard Vargas's name and his connection to the DA's death, information that was not yet public. That piqued the journalist's interest. A meeting was set. The location was an underground parking garage at a busy shopping mall, an anonymous place with plenty of escape routes. Arthur, disguised in a baseball cap and sunglasses, went to the meeting while Jonas and Harris watched from a distance. Lena and Clara remained at the safe house, their hearts in their throats. Andrea Davenport was exactly as she was on television, sharp, incisive, with a gaze that seemed to pierce anyone's defenses. Arthur told her the entire story, from the wine glass to the target list. With every word, he saw the skepticism on her face recede, replaced by an expression of shock and professional fascination. But she needed more than a story. She needed proof. That's when Arthur played his strongest card. He showed her on the screen of an encrypted laptop the photo Clara had taken, the image of the signet ring, of the powder falling into the glass. It was the irrefutable proof, the moment of the crime frozen in time. "The witness who took this picture is an 8-year-old girl," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion, "and she and her mother are in hiding with me. If you publish this, you will be exposing them to mortal danger." Andrea stared at the photo for a long time, the weight of that information settling on her. "If what you're telling me is true," she said finally, "this is bigger than anything I've ever covered. But I need to verify every detail, and I need full access to your witness. I need to hear her story in her own words." The demand was understandable, but terrifying. Exposing Clara to a stranger, even a trusted journalist, was an immense risk, but they had no choice. The next day, Andrea Davenport was brought to the safe house. The meeting between the veteran journalist and the young witness was one of the most tense moments of Arthur's life. He expected Clara to be intimidated, scared, but the girl, with her enigmatic calm, simply told her what she saw, with the clarity and simplicity of a child reporting a fact. She didn't embellish, didn't exaggerate, she just told the truth. And the truth, coming from her innocent mouth, was more powerful than any adult's testimony. With Clara's testimony and the evidence Arthur had gathered, Andrea and her team began working in absolute secrecy. They cross-referenced information, contacted international sources, validated the existence of Vargas's aliases, and found more potential victims. The story was taking shape, becoming a time bomb set to explode in the living rooms of millions of Americans. The air date was set for the night before the planned accident for the Chicago philanthropist. It was their only chance to warn her in time and catch the organization by surprise. The days leading up to the broadcast were the longest and most agonizing. They had lit the fuse and could now only wait for the explosion, not knowing if they would be consumed by it. On the night of the broadcast, the four of them gathered in front of the small television in the safe house. Arthur, Lena, Clara, and Jonas. Their fate, and that of many others, was about to be sealed live for the entire country to see. The opening theme for the nightly news rang out in the small room, each musical note charged with unbearable tension. Arthur held Lena's hand, their fingers laced in a grip that was both supportive and desperate. Clara sat on the floor, hugging her knees, her eyes fixed on the screen with an almost hypnotic concentration. Jonas stood by the window, watching the dark street, his silhouette framed against the dim twilight. Andrea Davenport's voice filled the room, serious and commanding. "Good evening. What you are about to see is the result of weeks of a secret investigation that uncovers an international organization that may be behind a series of deaths of major business leaders in the US and around the world." The report began. The pieces of the puzzle they had been living for weeks were now being assembled on screen for millions of viewers. The piece was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. Andrea laid out the pattern of deaths, the massive coronaries, the inexplicable accidents. She showed photos of the victims, powerful men and women whose deaths had been considered isolated tragedies. Then, she introduced the ghostly figure of the international investor, using the composite sketch Arthur had drawn with Clara's help. Arthur's heart hammered in his chest as he saw the face of his would-be murderer exposed to the nation. The report detailed the corporate infiltration, using the information Lena had gathered, and revealed the list of future targets, with the philanthropist's face prominently displayed. And then came the climax. The screen went dark for a moment, and Andrea's voiceover said, "The definitive proof of this organization's methods was captured by an eyewitness in a moment of instinctive courage." Clara's photo flashed on the screen, blurry, low angle, but undeniably powerful. The hand, the ring, the powder, the crime in progress. The moment the photo aired, Arthur knew there was no going back. Their world had been turned inside out, permanently. Jonas's phone began vibrating incessantly. Contacts, informants, the police. The story had exploded. The report ended with a direct appeal to law enforcement and a warning to other corporate leaders to be vigilant. As the credits rolled, Jonas turned to Arthur, his face grim. "They know. Whoever's watching now knows where that photo came from. They know the witness is with you. They're coming." Jonas's prediction came true faster than any of them could have imagined. Less than an hour later, Harris, the driver keeping watch outside, called Saar, his voice urgent and laced with panic. "They're here. 2 cars, pulled up at the end of the street. They're blocking the only way out. I think they're gearing up to breach." Panic seized the house. The safety of the hideout had evaporated, turning it into a trap. There was nowhere to run. Doors and windows were locked, furniture dragged to barricade the entrance. Arthur, who had never held a gun in his life, now clutched a pistol Jonas had given him. His hand shaking, the metal cold and alien. Lena grabbed Clara, trying to shield her with her own body. The sound of footsteps outside, of twigs snapping in the yard, made them all hold their breath. The final battle wouldn't be in a boardroom or a courtroom. It would be here, in this anonymous suburban house. Their survival was now measured in feet and inches. Amid the chaos, as Arthur and Jonas took positions near the front door, bracing for impact, Clara tugged on Arthur's sleeve. "Mr. Vance," she whispered, her voice surprisingly calm amid the terror. "There's another way out." Arthur stared at her, disbelieving. "What do you mean, Clara? There's no other door." "Not a door," she said, pointing to a small ventilation grate near the floor, hidden behind a sofa. "I saw the maintenance men use it. It goes to the basement. And in the basement, there's an old storm drain tunnel. It comes out at the creek behind the house. I measured. I can fit, and Mom can too if she scrunches down. You're too big, but maybe you could." The revelation was stunning. While he had been focused on doors and windows, Clara's childlike curiosity had discovered an escape route no adult would ever have considered. But there was a problem. The opening was small. Clara and Lena could make it. Jonas, maybe. But Arthur, with his broad shoulders, would never fit. Their survival depended on a terrible choice. He would have to stay behind to buy them time. The sound of the first window shattering upstairs was like a starting gun. The time for decisions was over. The time for raw, desperate action had arrived. "Go!" Arthur yelled at Lena, pushing her toward the vent Clara was pointing to. "Take Clara and go. Jonas, go with them." Lena looked at him, her eyes filled with a terror that went beyond the fear of the invaders. It was the terror of leaving him behind. "No! I'm not leaving you!" she cried, her voice torn with anguish. But Clara, with a maturity forged in the fire of the past few weeks, pulled on her mother's hand. "Mom, we have to go. He'll be okay. He's the knight." The reference to her old drawing hit Arthur like a physical blow. He was the knight, and the knight's duty was to protect Jonas. Understanding the brutal mathematics of the situation, didn't hesitate. He kicked the grate from the wall and gestured to Lena. "We don't have time, Mom. He's buying us the only thing that matters now, seconds." With one last, devastating look at Arthur, a look that held a universe of fear, gratitude, and something deeper that neither of them had had time to name, Lena squeezed into the dark opening, helped by Jonas. Clara was last. Before she went in, she ran to Arthur and hugged him with all the might in her small arms. "Thank you for taking care of us," she whispered in his ear. "Now it's our turn to help you." And then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness of the duct. Arthur was alone, the pistol heavy in his hand, the sound of men moving through the house growing closer. He dragged a heavy bookshelf in front of the opening, blocking their escape route and sealing his own fate. He didn't know how to fight, but he knew how to be an obstacle. He took up a position in the narrow hallway leading to the living room, a choke point where they could only come through one at a time. It was an indefensible position, a final, futile stand. He closed his eyes, the image of Clara's smile in his mind. If this was the end, at least he had kept his promise. He heard the living room door being kicked in. He braced for the impact, for the pain. But instead of gunfire, he heard shouts. Shouts of surprise and confusion, followed by the unmistakable sound of sirens, growing louder, closing in from all directions. Red and blue lights flashed erratically through the windows, sweeping the room in a chaotic ballet. The police, they were here. Arthur stood frozen, his mind scrambling to process the sudden shift. The home invasion turned into a desperate scramble to escape on the part of the criminals. Doors slammed, men yelled panicked orders at each other. And then, the thumping sound of a helicopter hovering overhead. The cavalry hadn't arrived by chance. Someone had called them. Minutes later, the front door was breached again, but this time by tactical officers shouting, "NYPD, hands in the air." Arthur dropped the gun and fell to his knees, hands on his head, his body shaking with overwhelming relief. When an officer approached him, he could only ask one thing: "How did you find us?" The cop grinned. "We didn't find you. You found us. We got an anonymous tip with this exact location. Caller said the key witness in a high-profile case was here and under imminent attack." It was then that Arthur understood Clara's whisper. "Now it's our turn to help you." Somehow, from the dark tunnel or the creek, Jonas, or perhaps Clara herself, using the burner phone, had made the call that saved his life. They didn't just escape, they fought back. The police operation that unfolded that night was massive. Andrea Davenport's report had put the entire force on high alert. The assault on the safe house was the organization's fatal mistake. They had stepped out of the shadows, confirming the journalist's story and serving themselves up on a silver platter. Richard Vargas was arrested trying to flee the country on a private jet. His accomplices, including the corporate infiltrators, were rounded up one by one, the network unraveling thread by thread. The DA's list of targets was the key to taking down the entire web. Amid the chaos outside the house, now surrounded by squad cars and news crews, Arthur saw Lena and Clara, safe, wrapped in emergency blankets. He ran to them, and the three of them embraced, a knot of relief, exhaustion, and a deep connection that words couldn't express. They had survived. Together. The battle was over. The war for justice and for the rebuilding of their lives was just beginning. 4 weeks after that night of terror and triumph, Arthur Vance's penthouse office was no longer a symbol of vulnerability, but of rebirth. The city sprawled at his feet, not as a reminder of his ruined empire, but as a landscape of new possibilities. The company, though still shaky, was saved. The exposure of the criminal network had revealed that the financial sabotage he'd been facing was actually part of Vargas's meticulous plan to weaken him before the final move. With this revelation, creditors and partners, once hostile, now offered their support, transforming Arthur from a failed businessman into a victim and a corporate hero. But the real transformation wasn't on his balance sheets. It was in his heart. Arrogance had given way to humility, blind trust to careful vigilance, and the loneliness of power to a new, unexpected form of family. Lena and Clara no longer lived in their modest Queen's apartment. At Arthur's insistent request, no longer the request of a boss to an employee, but of a man to the people he loved, they moved into a wing of his spacious penthouse. What began as a security measure became a natural, happy arrangement. Lena, now the head of internal corporate security, used her incredible perception of people to train employees to spot suspicious behavior, turning her life experience into an invaluable professional skill. She was no longer the invisible cleaner. She was a guardian, respected and admired. And Clara was the soul of this new world. With the official adoption process already underway, she was in every meaningful way the daughter Arthur never knew he needed. The conference room, the stage of the near crime, was transformed. Half of it remained a corporate space, but the other half was Clara's intuition lab. There, amidst a whiteboard and colorful beanbag chairs, the adoptive father and daughter developed a new kind of security consulting. Using games, puzzles, and hypothetical scenarios, Arthur taught Clara about the business world, while she taught him how to see what the eyes don't show. The hesitation in a voice, the lie in a smile, the truth in a gaze. Her observational skills, once a childhood survival instinct, were being honed into her greatest strength. On that sunny Tuesday morning, exactly 4 weeks after the life-saving spill, Arthur stood in the conference room, watching Clara. She was standing before a screen, presenting her analysis of a potential new business partner to a group of senior executives. "His smile doesn't reach his eyes," she said, with the same devastating simplicity she had used to describe Richard Vargas. "And when he talks about helping our company, he looks at his watch, not at you." The executives, who had initially seen this as their boss's eccentric whim, now took notes on every word, having learned the hard way the cost of ignoring wisdom that didn't come on a spreadsheet. Later that day, Arthur, Lena, and Clara stood together on the penthouse terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Lena rested her head on Arthur's shoulder, a gesture of comfort and belonging. Clara stood between them, holding both their hands. Arthur looked at the glass of grape juice in Clara's hand. The image of the other glass, the one that held his ruin, flashed in his mind, no longer with terror, but with a deep, serene gratitude. That glass, spilled by small, brave hands, had not just saved his life. It had poured out all the poison of his old existence, the loneliness, the pride, the blindness, and made room for something far more precious. He learned that true wealth wasn't found in risky deals, but in the courage to protect those who first protect you. And Clara discovered that her intuition and bravery had not only saved a man, but had given her the stable home and loving family she had always deserved. Family, he now understood, wasn't defined by blood, but by mutual acts of courage.